Good day, my name is Gordon O'Brien. I'm a scientist from the University of Mpumalanga in South Africa. And today on behalf of Hydroc for the Nile Basin Initiative, I'm going to present a blended learning module to you. This is the third blended learning module in a series of 5 titled Environmental Flow Assessment Methods. This is produced as an outcome of the NBI study titled Coarse Environmental Flow Assessments for Selected Sites in the Nile Basin. I encourage you to go and look at the introductory module, the first of the series of 5, which gives more of a background into the context of the environmental flow assessment methods and the frame that was developed as a part of the strategy for the management of environmental flows in the Nile Basin. But this series of blended learning modules is going to provide principles for good environmental flow aspects and e-flow assessment methods, which is what is the focus of this module. It also will consider transboundary management principles and practices, application of regional e-flow assessments, and the implementation of the Nile e-flows framework and the management of e-flows in the context of sustainable development goals. As I've mentioned, this is the third of 5 blended learning modules. The first is an introductory module. Then we have presented a module on the Nile environmental flow framework and its application. This module pertains to assessment methods, advantages and disadvantages of these different environmental flow assessment methods. The fourth module will consider application of these assessment methods, specifically looking at the application of the holistic environmental flow assessment method PROBFLO in Africa. And then finally, implementation considerations for the Nile e-flows framework in regional and national context, including sustainable development goals. The structure of each of the modules includes, and that's presented on the left here, specifically for this environmental flow assessment method. So all of the modules include these different sections: in introduction, objectives, content of the module, lessons, knowledge checks, and further reading recommendations. And we've provided an icon to just allow you to see where we are in the progression of those different sections of the module as we move through the module. Without further ado, let's get started. So what I've presented in the second assessment, which I'm just going to highlight here again, is the development processes of environmental flow assessment methods in the world, global development of different environmental flow assessment methods. And this was achieved in the context of the establishment of information pertaining to environmental flows globally. So a lot of these methods have been established in the early 1990s and then published. And you can see there have been many milestones of important developments pertaining to environmental flows. But this is just a relationship on where we are in the context of available environmental flow related information or publications in the context of the development of water resources. And you can see that following 2020, we proposed that we are passing into the 50 to 70% of water resources that are developed. So it's very important that we consider different environmental flow assessment methods, when they were established, how they've been utilized, what is the context that you can apply these different methods, some advantages and disadvantages of different methods, and all of this in the context of regional scale environmental flow management. And in the Nile Basin, the Nile Basin Environmental Flow Framework has been established to contribute to the management of sustainable water resource development in the Nile Basin. So there are different tools. What are these methods? So we've highlighted in module number 2 the difference between the environmental flow framework and the environmental flow assessment or the environmental e-flow determination methods. So now we're going to specifically look at the different methods. So what are they? They are tools. They are tools to characterize the original flow regimes of a river needed to maintain specific values or features of the ecosystem. Features include ecological, social, and economic characteristics or endpoints. Those are the things that we generally care about. Environmental flow assessment methods established for rivers and associated floodplains or estuaries and associated ecosystems are highlighted in this table. And there are 4 broad categories of different environmental flow assessment methods: hydrological methods, hydraulic rating methods, habitat simulation methods, and holistic methods. And we're going to unpack each of these methods in in detail in this blended learning module. All of them can be applied on a reconnaissance level, rapid level for implementation, and that's where the models are utilized. The associated uncertainty with the application should be considered, and they are generally only then used for planning purposes, for example. Comprehensive level implementation requires habitat or site assessment and empirical data collected from the field, and that information can then be used to establish environmental flow requirements for specific reaches and evaluate the consequences of specific developments on water resources. So we really recommend comprehensive levels of assessments for specific developments or activities, but for planning purposes, many of the other assessment methods are appropriate on a reconnaissance or rapid level of implementation. This thematic area will cover an introduction to the different methods. I've spoken about the categories. We're going to look at different methods, advantages and disadvantages of the different categories, good practice application of environmental flow methods for water resource management on multiple spatial scales for a range of users and regulators. That's what we're going to address in this module. The content includes principles of hydrological e-flow assessment methods, principles of hydraulic rating e-flow assessment methods and examples, principles of habitat simulation methods for environmental flow assessment and examples, principles of holistic and regional scale e-flow assessment methods and examples, and that includes environmental flow assessment frameworks. And then finally, we're going to look at some advantages and disadvantages of the different methods. Then we'll review the methods, application of the methods, and look at some literature for further reading. Let's move on straight into the hydrological environmental flow assessment methods. These methods are primarily based on the evaluation of hydrological data, and they are referred to as hydrological evaluation methods. They consider looking at hydrological data and hydrological statistics associated with that data. So they really only focus on flow, on the flow data. They consider multiple hydrological periods for different temporal periods, for example. They usually often consider and provide statistics for historical flows, current flows, and provide statistics and information for modeled future flows. This is where we need to consider attributes, aspects of the flow regime and the volume, timing, duration of flows, the different seasonality of ecosystems and associated flows, what are base flows, what are high flows, what are high flow pulses, what are overbank flows, what are floods, and what would be important for subsistence flows for ecosystem. These are the different characteristics of hydrological environmental flow assessment methods. The outcomes include fixed percentile or lookup tables. So this entire method is based on evaluating hydrological data. They usually can provide this information for different points in a basin, and it allows you to consider the changes in flows between different scenarios, historical scenarios, present scenarios, future scenarios, for example. Although they are hydrology based, many include other variable considerations, but there is very weak correlation between other variables and the flow data itself. These are some examples of the different outputs of hydrological environmental flow assessment methods, and as you can see on the top left, we can represent where the different accumulation of flows would occur within a basin to give you an indication of how much water is available on a relative scale within a particular catchment area. And then in terms of the hydrological or flow duration curves, we can provide information on mean, monthly, average data for different scenarios, and you can then be able to consider the relative volume, the timing of different flows. You can look at the months and what would the base flow requirements be, what would the flood requirements be, for example. Those type of hydrological statistics are available from the application of these different hydrological flow assessment methods. There are many different methods available. These are some examples, including the Texas method that was developed in 1991, basic flow method, 1996, range of variability approach, flow translucency approach, desktop environmental flow requirements determination tool by Hughes and Hannart in 2003, the desktop reserve model, for example, and SPATSM are different tools that are used to evaluate and produce these statistics. There are many tools available. These are some examples. In summary, These hydrological environmental flow methods can be implemented on multiple spatial scales with available modeled and or observed hydrological past and present data. They provide alterations to the volume. The information they provide is alterations to the volume, timing, and duration of flows, and that can be related to flow ecological indicators, where you can look at the consequences, for example, of a significant reduction in flows, but those are not generally linked explicitly using data. This approach does not allow for the evaluation of the relationship between flows, habitats, and ecological components of ecosystems that depend on these habitats. But they are incorporated in the other types of environmental flow assessments as a foundational phase. So it's more of a cumulative increasing complexity of environmental flow, different methods or categories that we're going to discuss. The second category is hydraulic rating environmental flow assessment methods, and this foundation for this method is the hydrological approach, where you have the hydrological data and the associated statistics. Now, in the hydraulic rating assessment method, that flow and the variability of flows is presented or evaluated in the context of water available in the ecosystem itself. So it requires a hydraulic component, where you're looking at the availability of different types of habitats in the environment and different levels, for example. It links habitats and associated ecological components to the flows. It also considers change in hydraulic variables, including wetted perimeter or maximum depths, biotopes, for example, velocity depth profiles. And that's important improvement or increasing complexity from the hydrological methods, because now you have information on the habitat characteristics that are provided as a result of that flow variability. The objective is to maintain ecological or social objectives associated with habitat availability. Some examples include the generic wetted perimeter method or R2 cross method, presented by Tharm in 2003. In summary, hydraulic rating environmental flow methods can be implemented on multiple spatial scales, from a site scale to a reach scale, with accuracy, with available modeled and or observed hydrological past and present data overlaid onto models. This provides direct relationship between hydrological and hydraulic variables, velocity depth, wetted perimeter information, for example, habitat characteristics, that is, and alterations to the volume, timing, duration of flows is related to flow ecological indicators. In some cases, again, there's no direct correlation. This allows for the evaluation of relationships between flows and habitats and infers the relationship with ecological components of ecosystems that depend on those flows or habitats. And what's important here is that you still get information on at what point you start to flood floodplains, and that floodplain inundation is provided. But that's based on the method. Then looking at habitat simulation environmental flow assessment methods. This is again upscaling from the hydraulic simulation methods. This is based on detailed analyses of the quantity and quality of suitable in-stream physical habitats for specific indicators, usually indicator species, during different flow conditions. And the example here is provided is the habitat preferences or requirements of different species, for example. And when you have flows, when you start to provide flows that meet these habitat requirements for species. It integrates hydrological and hydraulic data and the biological response data, usually of one or two or few indicator species. The approach produces flow-related changes. Flow-related changes are modeled in different programs or tools that are used. Simulated available habitat characteristics are linked to indicators. The outputs include habitat discharge curves for biota or extended as habitat time and exceedance series data, which is used to predict optimum flows in an environmental flow requirement study. And the example here would be to demonstrate what the habitat preferences or requirements would be for different species. This is an indication on this graph of the different habitat biotope features for different fish in river ecosystems, from fast deep, fast intermediate, fast shallow, fast, very shallow, slow, deep, slow, shallow, and slow, very shallow habitat characteristics, and the availability of these different habitat characteristics associated with discharge in a particular environment. And that information would be used in relation to the requirements or preferences of that species to provide a threshold of environmental flow requirements, which can be determined for different months of the year based on the preferences and requirements of different species. Examples of these habitat-based environmental flow methods include PHABSIM, which was established in 2008, in-stream method in 2011, mesoHABSIM, and the demonstration flow assessment method. Habitat-based environmental flow methods can be implemented on multiple spatial scales, from a site reach to a reach scale with accuracy, and include available modeled or observed hydrological past and present data overlaid onto the models to provide a direct relationship between the hydrology, hydraulic variables, the velocity depth preferences or characteristics, for example, and ecological requirements of indicator species independently. Alterations to the volume, timing, and duration of flows are related to flow ecological indicators. This allows for the evaluation of the relationships between flow habitats and ecological components of ecosystems that depend on these flows or habitat characteristics. And finally, moving on to holistic or regional scale environmental flow methods. These methods integrate driver, response components, biophysical characteristics, indicators, measures, and a range of alternative management or flow decisions into the context of multiple endpoints. So what we're doing here is trying to represent those socio-ecological systems and all the important features or characteristics of those systems. We do acknowledge that you cannot represent the entire system, but we strive to have indicators or representation of all the important attributes of those ecosystems, what those variables are, how do we measure the different characteristics or features of those ecosystems, how do we understand how those features interact with one another or each other. That's what the systems are based on. They holistic environmental flow methods include upscale from hydrological, hydraulic rating, and habitat simulation methods, and it is currently considered to be best scientific practice. Some examples include the building block methodology, which was established and widely developed in South Africa and widely used in Southern Africa, bottom-up flow stressor response method, top-down downstream response to imposed flow transformations or the drift process, and PROBFLO, which I'm going to present in this assessment. We'll give examples just now. Holistic environmental flow assessment methods can be implemented on multiple spatial scales from site to basin scale with high accuracy and include available modeled and or observed hydrological data and provide direct relationship of the social and ecological consequences of altered flows. And that includes the volume, time, and duration of flows, and that would be related to socio-ecological endpoints and the flows and non-flow variables that are driving those endpoints. These probability modeling procedures can be adaptable and improved with monitoring data after implementation. These approaches are expert and data intensive, but provide reliable outcomes with associated minimal or low uncertainty. I'm going to move on to some examples, and the first example I'd like to present is the BBM method. These are schematic diagrams of the building block methodology. The approach taken here is for a range of socio-ecological experts to collect data to determine flow ecosystem and flow ecosystem service relationships, and during a workshop environment to come and present the requirements of different flow and or different social and ecological features or characteristics of the environment, and to present a case for the environmental flow requirements of those different attributes. And the financial attributes are built on top of one another on a different monthly basis, where all the different socio-ecological parts of an ecosystem are considered one by one. And so the idea is that in terms of discharge or flow, the amount of flow required to maintain these systems, the base requirement would potentially maintain the ecosystems to allow the system to maintain different species, for example, and different processes And then at different times of the year, especially during the flood phases, for example, you would have different requirements for different components that would build on or add to those foundational blocks. For example, you would need flows to maintain the different species. You would need flows to provide ecological cues to initiate spawning migrations, for example. You would need flows to inundate habitats and provide additional habitat characteristics to allow for recruitment. You would have flows that then would provide for the duration of different habitat characteristics to allow species to recruit. And then you'd also have flow requirements to allow different species to access different habitats, to move, to fulfill certain processes, to flush and or move sediments within a particular system, all related to defined socio-ecological characteristics of that ecosystem. The outcome would be a representation of the natural flow hydrograph again, related to depths or discharge, and then you'd be able to then represent what would be the environmental flow requirement, which would follow a similar shape, and then how much water would be available for storage and utilization or development. Okay. Here's an example of the application of the building block methodology in the Nile River Basin in the context of this environmental flow determination or assessment methods for the Mara. Just a short example where, from a fish perspective, this is a cyprinid, an indicator species established as an indicator species for the Nile River. And what we would have information on, for example, this is an example of for different times of the year, we would know what would the ecological cues be, what would the migration cues be, what would the maintenance cues be, what would the recruitment cues be or requirements be, habitats be for larvae and different species, for feeding, for spawning, for example, for movement. All these different attributes would be available for different times of the year that you could then take back to an environmental flow assessment workshop. And then those different flows from a fish perspective would be able to be presented to a hydrologist who would be able to determine, integrate all of these requirements into a scenario and provide the environmental flow requirements for a particular river. And you can see at different times of the month, you would have these maintenance flows, you would have different classes of freshets and floodlets as well, and what the volumes of those floods would be associated with habitat availability, and that would also really be explicitly linked to the requirements, life history requirements of different indicator species and their attributes. And you would integrate the requirements of many aspects of an ecosystem, the in-stream biota, riparian biota, ecosystem services and the provision of services, for example. You would include processes, and all of that information together would be provided to a hydrologist who would integrate it into a scenario and provide the minimum environmental flow requirement. And the outputs of these type of assessments would generally be these flow duration tables, which are very useful. And we can present some of the different requirements of different scenarios that would be tested through this type of assessment using the median 50th percentile flow duration or flow discharge data for a particular site. And here's an example where the natural present base flows, environmental water requirements, and two development scenarios are presented on the same curve to give you the relative representation of the different levels. You can see the natural flows are presented, the natural flows are right up here, where the environmental water requirements or the environmental flow requirements are there. And you'd see some of the scenarios are between those development curve, but some are below, especially some of the more vulnerable aspects. And here you can see what the natural flow duration has been for the more vulnerable parts of the flow duration table, and how some of the new development scenarios, including environmental flows, reduce that, but it still doesn't go down to zero, which is very important. Again, the flow duration tables are presented. The result is presented in a flow duration table. In the Mara case study, this is an example of where we considered different lines of evidence to carry out a BBM assessment of the environmental flows for the Nile River. The title here is Flow Stress Response, because the first step of this assessment was to look at the flow duration or flow ecosystem relationships, establish those flow ecosystem relationships using different flow stress response approaches and bring that together at a workshop, which then allowed us to then apply the building block methodology. And some of these indicators that were established during this assessment, for example, was to look at the lobia barbus recruitment and the growth of daily rings and get an idea of when species are recruiting, when have they historically been responding to important flows, and when those important flows should be provided into the environment, and how much water is needed to provide those cues to support the spawning and recruitment of different species. We also had information on the biology of feeding biology of indicator species and relationships between invertebrates and invertebrate habitat characteristics in the fish, for example, from a feeding perspective. We had information on population structures and good years where you'd have good recruitment to different years, bad years where you had poor recruitment to different years, and that gave us some indication of what would the habitat characteristics look like to optimize the recruitment of fish. What was the value of years, for example, when you had floods and there were floodplains available to allow fish to spawn and recruit into the system, and they contributed to the population, which was evaluated by considering population structures. And finally, for indicator species, we established their preferences for velocities, depths, cover features, and substrate types, and all of this information was integrated to provide the environmental flow preferences for different species. One of the opportunities we had in the case study was to look at relationships between, do some multivariate statistics, and we look at community metric measures, and we could determine, in this case study, the present ecological state of fish communities. We could use Bayesian networks to evaluate the well-being of different communities, and also what was the major drivers of these communities, which we also evaluated using multivariate statistical methods. This is an example of a redundancy analysis plot where we looked at the relationship between different communities and communities associated with sites along the system, and what would be driving the differences and the changes in communities based on the data that we had available. We were able to use that information to determine suitability curves for different flows associated with habitats for different species. Okay. In some of our case studies where we looked at habitat availability and the well-being of different species, this is a plot to represent the velocity and depth associations of different species, and at what point we get different species that utilize different habitat characteristics, and what would be considered to be more important velocity depth characteristic compared to others. And by integrating all of these flow, stressor response, or these relationships for all these different species, we're able to identify these preference areas, these curves, where we could look at the requirements of different species and associate with different flows in a catchment. And that's some examples of our application of flow stress response and the building block methodology in different parts of Africa. I'd then like to move on to presenting the downstream response to imposed flow transformation method, which is called DRIFT. The acronym is DRIFT, and it has been established by Southern Waters, who are based in the Cape. And I'd just like to acknowledge Jackie King, Kate Brown, and Ms. Hubert, who've done a lot of the development work through the years. This tool has been established in South Africa but implemented throughout the world, and it really has been impressive to see what the benefits have been of applying this holistic environmental flow assessment method globally. It's a process and software. The software has a license fee for managing knowledge on the links between river flows and ecosystem functioning, but it's quite well available, and there's some good support tools for the application of the method. It's time series based on external hydrology, hydraulic and sediment modeling data of development plans, as well as other scenarios they need, a benchmark indication of what the historical data would look like as well, and what the deviation is from that information to the environmental variables that are going to be changed. It considers minimum requirements for hydrological data, or the minimum requirement is for hydrological data, and any additional data will be can be incorporated and built into the modeling process. Where models are not available for such drivers like geomorphology, fish, vegetation abundances, drift itself, which is suggesting it overlapping more towards a framework type approach. Drift has built in all the historical consequences of altered flows for different types of habitat characteristics, and you can create a time series data and hypothesize a flow ecosystem relationship to represent that part of the study based on limited information, which can then be incorporated into the study. It will result in some uncertainty, but it can be addressed in an adaptive management context as well. Uses a combination of data, knowledge, and experience to predict how river ecosystems will change. Informs the social assessments of potential impacts on river users. This is a procedural step, schematic of the procedural steps of drift, where you select indicators, select sites or focus areas. You apply the modeled hydraulic data to provide an indication of habitat suitability associated with flows. It will give an indication of flow suitability in response to your indicators. So that's the flow ecosystem relationships. You assign baseline status and trends, which I'll show you in a moment. Then knowledge capture set up by drift at all sites is used to create these response curves based on that available information. You validate it, and then you integrate all of them in an analysis phase, and then you run drift for all the scenarios, generate and predict changes and the consequences of changes on those systems. This is an example of the application of drift in India, Pakistan area of Asia, downstream of the Himalayas, where different sites are selected and relationships are established for these different nodes along the lengths of river, and these socio-ecological systems are constructed that represent the important unique relationships between different socio-ecological system variables and how they interact with each other for each of those different nodes within the entire basin. The drift model integrates all of these different indicators that represent all these different sites using a decision support system that is available through a software package, and that integration is done using the drift model. For these applications of the drift assessment, there are standard indicators that should be considered to represent the important base flows, freshet flows, flood flows that have already been listed for application. And what's very useful about this is that when you start a new case study, you can go back to some of these recommended indicators and collect the data to represent that component of the system, which would help describe the variability and of the resilience of that system to altered flows, the relationship between flows and those ecosystem and social components, and how they interact with one another based on what has been incorporated into drift assessment historically. And then information can be unpacked and applied, and especially where there is no data is available, but important characteristics of the system or attributes of the system are known or hypothesized. Some of that historical information can be used to represent that part of that system and still be incorporated into a drift assessment, and later the uncertainty associated with the use of that solicitation can be reduced by collecting real information for that particular attribute, which is very useful. Okay, so the way that it combines, each component is mapped and linked and integrated in the assessment. Then the response curves on what the relative change in relation to the extended number of dry seasons or changes in either volume, timing, duration, or flows would occur. These response curves are established that represent how those variables interact with one another, and then the scenario can be queried, which applies some of these response curves to determine the consequences of altered flows. And some of these rating assessments are available to propose the equivalent loss or gain of different characteristics of these attributes. And all of these components are different input variables that you can build into our understanding of the system the way those variables interact within the system and the consequences of altered flows based on our understanding of what are the attributes, how they interact with one another, what's driving those systems are carried out. So it includes these important features. As a part of the study, what is very useful is the consideration of the cumulative effects of extended periods of not achieving a particular volume, timing, duration, and frequency of flows. And here's an example of an indicator where the relationship and the percentage change over in relation to flows was provided based on this on a relationship. And the argument here is that the onset of the dry season represents a time where this particular species are able to migrate into shallow areas with suitable substrate for spawning. Earlier onset allows the fish greater time to migrate, but late onset can disrupt the spawning migration and maturation. Also, if dry season starts earlier, it will be beneficial as the fish can mature in less stressful conditions prior to spawning. And you can get an indication of the relationship between the duration of flows and the effects of these long extended periods of dry flows or high flows or wet flows using this feature of the tool, which evaluates the potential long-term effects or the cumulative effects of altered flows over many years. These are some indications of the responses of different species and how they can be related to modeling the future changes in the potential characteristics or condition of a particular endpoint. In this case, the catch of tons of a different species that can be incorporated, and you can get an idea of whether or not, based on our understanding of the relationship between that variable and altered flows, whether that will be continue or be provided in the future or not. And this information is used, these are just indications of where this information was used to relate these different effects. So the drift prediction, once it's integrated the information from all of these indicators and our understanding of the relationship between indicators and variables using this decision support system, the drift provides prediction of the change of each year, and you can then provide a series of future responses based on our understanding of that relationship and that how it contributes to the different parts of the year. Curves are combined using multi-criteria decision support analysis procedures, and that will give you an idea using these outputs for different scenarios, for example, for all the different habitat characteristics and the associated ecological endpoints, whether you'll have significant change, negative change, or positive change based on the consequence of altered flows. And you can then start to highlight some of the severe changes and the socio-ecological consequences, the extent of those changes and the relevance of that change to these different attributes. And then once you've integrated that, you can then provide these type of potential consequences of these different scenarios. And this is a case study as an output of a drift assessment where we have a range of all of these different scenarios, and you can see in relation to present day what would the relative consequence be of alternative decision-making options, and you can then decide what would the best balance be for the use and protection of the resource based on the integration of all of these relationships, and that the system as a whole would be responding to not only changes in volumes but timing, duration, frequency of different flows at different times, and the consequences of those changes by querying different types of scenarios. And the outputs of that information are would be very, very useful to compare in a relative scale between each other, and that would be applicable for each reach of the assessment of the river. But drift does have the ability to look at the requirements of connectivity, and based on the requirement upstream, it would then provide it would then evaluate the suitability of the habitat and habitat characteristics downstream, for example. Here's some outcomes. This was an assessment for a relationship between use and protection, where you have a low, medium, or high use and the associated consequences of altered flows for the main stem rivers and wet floodplain area in the Okavango Delta. And you can just see that drift not only provides the socio-ecological consequences of altered flows, but what are the flows required to maintain that ecosystem in an acceptable state, and that equates to the environmental flow requirements for the system. Then we move on finally to PROBFLO. PROBFLO is a holistic environmental flow assessment method that was developed through regional scale ecological risk assessments. Based on the regional scale ecological risk assessment approach, PROBFLO was developed. And the value of PROBFLO, which is quite unique, is the ability of the method to evaluate the probable risk and associated so what it tries to do is it is allowed to determine the socio-ecological consequences of altered flows in the context of risk and the probabilities and likelihoods of adverse effects or hazards occurring that would then hinder the ability of an endpoint, whether it is a social endpoint or an ecological endpoint, to occur as a result of altered flows. So it's a very useful context or area of science that has been used to establish this environmental flow assessment method. To start off with, let's just discuss what risk is. So risk is three things. It incorporates the probability of exposure or a hazard or some form of multiple stress or hazard occurring that it then can enter or alter an ecosystem. The probability of the hazard occurring itself, whether there's a release or of a stressor or the source that's resulting in an impact, and the probability of that combination of exposure and the release occurring having an effect on an endpoint, a cultural value, or an ecological attribute. And only where the probability of the hazard occurring, the probability of there being exposure into the environment, and the environment responding to that effect is where you ultimately end up with risk. And those three the probabilities of those three attributes or components together, and the higher the probability of either of those occurring, would result in higher possibility of risk. And this is a very robust foundation that has been used to evaluate risk of multiple stresses on regional scales throughout the globe. The regional scale ecological risk assessment builds on traditional ecological risk assessments, where you evaluate, in traditional assessments, you would evaluate the potential of a particular type of stressor. It may be, for example, a contaminant affecting a particular receptor from an environment that may, for example, include a particular vulnerable species that is sensitive to that stressor, and what the response of the species would be. Would the individuals die as a result of the stressor? Would it reduce their fitness? What would the consequences be? And the traditional risk assessments would consider the potential of a particular stressor, whether it be a contaminant, having an effect on that particular species or endpoint, would be the risk of that stressor to that endpoint. On a regional scale, what's important is now you have multiple stresses, you have multiple receptors, and you have ranked ecological impacts and multiple locations of those responses, which would constitute the risk of all these synergistic activities, these synergistic stresses that would then work with each other to then result in risk. And in the late 1990s, progression was made from the traditional risk assessment approach to a regional scale approach by Uyghurs and Landers in particular. And what was important there was to consider the location of the sources of stresses, the locations that evaluate the locations of these multiple receptors within these habitats, as well as the locations of those ranked ecological impacts. And that allows us to then evaluate the probable effect of altered flows on a regional scale. So the one thing that PROBFLO provides, let me see if we've got some references here. These are the references that we propose that you look at. And I just wanted to highlight at this point that the one thing that PROBFLO provides is the socio-ecological consequences of altered flows in the form of an ecological risk assessment, where you are provided with a probable risk of these different multiple stresses associated with altered flows, driving those values and features that we care about in an environment, and that can be social and or ecological endpoints. The second thing that we do with PROBFLO is that we use the model, because of the representation of the system and how the system responds to altered flows, to actually provide us with minimum flow requirements, the minimum quantity, quality, timing of flows required to maintain that ecosystem in an acceptable condition, And that in this context is an acceptable level of risk to those endpoints. And that is a very robust, useful foundation to determine environmental flows and the probable consequences of altered flows and the consequences of the hypothesized environmental flows to those socio-ecological endpoints. So it's very useful. These are 3 publications that we just suggest that you look at. The last publication in particular includes case studies of the application of PROBFLO in the Nile Basin, which is what the last presentation or the next blended learning module would be based on. Okay, so in the context of the framework of the multiple sources of stresses, multiple receptors, that risk framework where you have those probable risk pathways, PROBFLO is built on conceptual models to represent the probable risk pathways using available information in the context of the risk relationship. So this is the equation, the way you consider exposure and ecological effect, and this is how we've just considered it. And what we do is we build these conceptual models that represent the probable risk pathways from sources to stresses, habitats, and endpoints. So the idea here is to represent that socio-ecological system and what's driving that system, and represent in a hypothetical context the probable consequences of dams resulting in changes to flows, changes to water quality, changes to habitat, and people associated with the flows who can possibly affect disturbance to wildlife, and how that affects these multiple stresses that occur within the environments that we care about, the rivers, the wetlands, groundwater, and dams. And that in turn will then have a negative effect, or has the potential to have a negative effect on endpoints that we've established for a particular study that represent the vision and the objectives, the features and the condition of those features that we care about in the environment. And they can be social and ecological endpoints. And once we have this information, if we can start putting data behind the not only what are the pathways, but what are the variables that we use to represent a system in a risk assessment, our understanding of how those variables interact with one another, what the natural variability of environmental variables has been, and how the system has responded to changes in that variability, and how the system, what requires different ecosystem attributes or the conditions of the environment, what the different endpoints require. If we can put that together, we can then create a model that represents that socio-ecological system, and the way that that model responds will give us an indication of the consequences of altered flows, and we can use that model as well to tell us what the minimum flow requirements would be in an environmental flow context. And what do we use to represent that model? We use Bayesian networks. And Bayesian networks is a neural network that uses Bayes' theorem to represent the socio-ecological system, and we then incorporate these measures and indicators to represent that system. PROBFLO has this 10-step process. These are just some of the important steps that are highlighted here, and we apply these steps when we do an environmental flow assessment incorporating PROBFLO. Moving on. So in PROBFLO, when we establish these conceptual models, what we're doing is we're trying to represent probable relationships between, and when we talk about relationships, we're looking at pathways of risk between sources, stresses, receptors, and responses of those receptors to the stresses within the habitats and then the impact. And this is an example of how we would use this information to represent how the system would respond to changes. So what I've proposed here, and this is unpacking part of a conceptual model, to look at how the maintenance of subsistence fisheries in a case study, and or the maintenance of indicator fish species in a river would be good indicators of the social and ecological attributes of an ecosystem. And I would just like to go through the risk pathways to demonstrate how we establish that what indicators are chosen, and that there are interactions between these indicators. In effect, the risk pathways from these sources all the way to these ranked ecological impacts associated with the endpoints. So in this case study, I've proposed that there are these different types of land use activities: agricultural activities, industries, mines, peri-urban activities, urban settlements, including urban settlements and peri-urban settlements, and livestock activities. There are dams and diversions, there's alien biota, and there's the probable effects of climate change affecting this particular case study. In terms of the stresses, these activities are all associated with an existing landscape and include established development opportunities for that landscape. So It's a different scenarios based on a real case study. So these different activities, the activities associated with these stresses, including flow alterations, water quality alterations, habitat change, and disturbance to wildlife, where the flow alterations, for example, include a reduction in the volume of flows, the alteration in the timing of flows, and the duration of flows. And we want to understand the consequences of those changes. The receptors that we chose to represent these endpoints or these attributes of the ecosystem that we care about include the preferences of subsistence species, preferred subsistence species from a subsistence fisheries perspective, and then looking at these and the subsistence fisheries in particular target these large growing species. Then we looked at any other species that was consumed for subsistence. We considered migrating indicator species, rheophilic or species that choose fast-flowing water, fishes that have those preferences, and also floodplain indicator species, because this particular case study had a floodplain ecosystem. So those were the receptors that we selected to represent how these indicators would respond to these stresses. In terms of the response, we hypothesized we have some data to argue that if the volume of water reduces, the consequence would be that you would have a reduction in habitat characteristics, which would affect these gills. If the volume reduced, you would have a reduction in connectivity, which would also reduce the potential for species to migrate and affect the indicator migratory species. If you had changes in flows, changes in the volume, changes in the duration, changes in the frequency of flows, we would have changes in the availability of ecological cues, which would then also reduce the gill. This can also relate not necessarily to the fact that species are not spawning anymore, but that if they are spawning at the wrong time, you may have negative impacts on the recruitment of fish. If you change the duration of flows, you reduce habitat availability and the duration of those habitats, and that would affect recruitment, for example. If you had changes in the water quality, you would reduce the gill, and there would be some improvements. For example, some species are vulnerable to increases in nutrient enrichment of a particular system, where other species would benefit, and that's where we would show that the gill would go down and or up. If you had changes in water quality or reduction in water quality, you would lose the intolerant species. If you had changes in habitat, you would negatively impact habitat gills of species that have preferences for specific habitats, and or some species may proliferate. If you convert a rheophilic type of environment to a lentic type of environment because of the construction of a dam, you would negatively affect the species that have high preferences for flows, but you would be benefiting those species that have got a high preference for pool type habitats. And if you had disturbance to wildlife impacts, you would generally affect the gills, and that would be related to alien invasive species as well as disturbance to wildlife directly from people. And if you look at the relationships, what would this result in? What are the potential impacts? So from a maintenance of subsistence fisheries perspective, there is a potential for the reduction or loss of fisheries association and the associations and social impacts. In the context of the maintenance of indicator riverine species and floodplain species, here at the bottom you would lose indicator species or you would lose indicator floodplain species. And this relationship, this risk pathways from sources, stresses, receptors, response, impact in a PROBFLO assessment is represented and constructed using Bayesian probability networks. And this is an example where we use subsistence fisheries as an endpoint, which in this case would be a function of a suitable environment. So where we have the ability of people to harvest fish, we have the production of fish, and we have the demand for fish, for example, we would then be able to evaluate the risk to subsistence endpoints. And I'll get into this type of probability modeling in more detail in the demonstration of PROBFLO as a case study in the next blended learning module. So the example of our Bayesian network set up with Netica, which is a free software available. The colors relate to the endpoints, the input response variables, the exposure input variables, and the exposure child variables, the different colors. And we try to stick to that color model in all of our assessments. So what we do is in a PROBFLO assessment, we use a support tool or a Excel-based calculation spreadsheet, risk calculation spreadsheet, where we have different components. We look at the Bayesian networks, the nodes, scenarios, what are the parent nodes, input nodes. We look at conceptual probability tables, and all of the querying is done in Excel. So what that allows us to do is to build the monitoring tools in Excel that would then upload, have questionnaires associated with it, upload the data directly into a Bayesian network format that can be used to query Bayesian network models. And we have all the justification and threshold data to query those indicators also in that Excel model, so that any of the updates and changes can be made directly in the Excel model, and that can automatically be incorporated or uploaded to drive the Bayesian network. So in effect, we have the Bayesian networks running in parallel with this Excel-based risk calculation model, which interact, and you can use that information to run the models relatively easily. Okay, and this is an example of how all of it comes together in terms of the process. So we've designed the calculation template. We paste the network tool later once it's established, so we can see what the network looks like in the calculation tools. These are the sheets that we work on that we can click from each node to different components. We export the nodes to Netica and expand the table. All the scenarios are evaluated or queried based on the justification tables, and these justification tables that are very important provides the empirical evidence behind the selection of the indicators, the selection of the measures and the units that are used to represent that indicator, and for each different region that's being considered in the study, what is the threshold data to represent that variable in an ideal, altered, or severely altered state, depending on the ranking scheme that's selected for each case study. Yeah, let me move on. So what we do is we then apply and run the different subsections of the Bayesian networks that are relevant to each endpoint. Once we've got the risk profile distribution for each endpoint, we integrate all of that information using a randomization tool. We generally use Monte Carlo simulation or Latin hypercube simulation tools, and that integrates the data into these probable risk curves, which we then use to evaluate the consequences of altered flows. Here's an example of the application of PROBFLO. This was an example that was undertaken for fisheries, the potential loss of fisheries in a floodplain, river floodplain ecosystem associated with the development of the floodplain and climate change. And what we presented here is the socio-ecological consequences based on risk probability profiles for a range of these endpoints. We selected these 5 endpoints: water for people, healthy families, ecotourism, healthy ecosystems, and important, the maintenance of subsistence fisheries, which is what a large portion of the community depends on. So based on this assessment, what we demonstrated was the change in the risk based on different scenarios associated with different years. So for 1985, we know that the water quality was in a relatively pristine condition. There was the flows were in a pristine condition. There were some changes to water chemistry. There was some slight alterations in flows and associated habitat, or just habitat characteristics, and there was a slight alteration in disturbance to wildlife threats associated with an increase in community and possibly some alien invasive species that were driving the community. But generally you can see, if you consider 0, low, moderate, or high, where you have natural, low is relatively suitable management range. Moderate would be that area where it's not ideal, but it's not high risk, so you've got to be careful, that threshold of potential concern zone. And then finally, the high risk would be that range where all of the endpoints would now be in an unsustainable state. And these risk profiles give you an indication of the probability of each of these different ranks being achieved, each of these different risk ranges being achieved based on the input. And for 1985, for all of these endpoints, you can see that the probability, following the outcome of the assessment, that the probability is a 0 or low risk distribution. If we then move to 2012, we had data from 2012. I've just highlighted the 1985 distribution. You can see from 2012 to 1985 to 2012, we've had a deterioration of flows, we've had a deterioration of water quality, we've had a deterioration of habitat and disturbance to wildlife, and you can see as a result, we've had a massive shift in the probable risk distribution, especially for maintenance fishery, which is what I'm highlighting here. You can see that the ecosystems are relatively more vulnerable based on the fact that it occurs on the most far right of all of these risk profiles. But you can see that profile that we found in 1985, which gives us a high probability of zero risk, has shifted across to the low risk range. And now you can see that there is some uncertainty, so we're less certain because we've had an increase in the synergistic effects of multiple stresses. But we now have a 22% probability of the fisheries occurring in this concerning or moderate risk range, but we still have an 87% probability that the supply of fish will exceed demand. So that doesn't look too bad in 2012. With the 2025 climate change projection, we know that the hypothesized changes in flow and flow availability will result in an increase from a BC state to a D state. So it's a severe deterioration of quantity of flows, severe deterioration of quality, and now moderate changes in habitat and disturbance to wildlife. And you can see from that new profile, you can see again, we've had another massive shift towards the right. And now we have a 72% probability that the fish will be in that threshold of potential concern or concerning condition. And we have a new 9% chance of total collapse of the fish community. Interesting here, relative to the fisheries, you can see that the ecosystem as a whole has got an 18% probability, close to an 18% probability of complete failure, which again demonstrates the relatively more how relatively more vulnerable that ecosystem endpoint is compared to fisheries, because the fish community would then target, the subsistence fishing community would initially target their preferred cichlid species, but then as the population of cichlids would deteriorate, they would then target any other species, resulting in the use of fingerling and juvenile fish for subsistence fisheries. So you can see that's an indication of how relatively more vulnerable they are, where from an ecosystem perspective, we would not tolerate reductions in biodiversity, but fisheries endpoint would. And what would be driving those endpoints, if you consider what drives this new risk probability distribution? The rainfall intensity would increase, wet dry phases would increase, so the increases in droughts, increases in excessive flooding, and you would have alterations to the timing and duration of flows. Okay. Here's an example of outcomes of the application of PROBFLO. This is just to show you what it looks like. So in this case study, what we proposed for the Inner Niger Delta would be the flow variability in cubic meters per second for a range of different scenarios: reference scenario, historical scenario, environmental flow scenario that was determined through the PROBFLO application, present day scenario 1 and 2, and then future flows 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you can see that based on these different scenarios, if you compare them to reference flows, you can see that there's quite a considerable shift in the variability of flows for the different scenarios. And we wanted to evaluate the socio-ecological consequences of these differences. We can also present the data based on available hydrodynamic modeling on the inundation area of the floodplain, because that quantitative understanding of available flows and available habitats and the abundance of ecosystem services and associated products was very important for this case study. So we could present that. You can see that there's quite a similar trend, but the area is in square kilometers, and you can see how with some of the scenarios the extent of that flooding would reduce considerably. These are two graphs of the socio-ecological consequences of these scenarios, and the first graph is the ecosystem endpoints for each of the scenarios, and the second is the social endpoints. And you can see that with all of the reference historical environmental flows present 1 and 2, you generally have this 0 to moderate risk distribution, where there's some possibility of high risk, but you're generally shifting from an ecosystem perspective from that low moderate risk in towards where future flows 2, 3, and 4 all demonstrate that distribution in a high unacceptable state. And even future scenario 5, although it has a much greater representation of the flow variability, we still have this excessively high possibility of high risk for that endpoint. So you can see from this relative consideration of the risk to these different, to the ecological endpoints combined for each of these scenarios, which of the futures becomes unacceptable. And in relation to these unacceptable future scenarios where demand exceeds supply and the use would become excessive, you can compare that to the environmental flow distribution, which is this one over here, which shows that you would maintain the system in a moderately modified state. If you compare that to the social endpoints, and in this context we were considering fisheries, the harvesting of vegetation for subsistence livelihoods, as well as water diseases, similarly, you can see that the trend shifts towards the high risk, with the first reference and historical scenarios now being a lot more, the percentiles, from 20th to 80th percentile occurring in the low risk rank. That's what these colors represent: 0, low, moderate, and high, with a shift towards high risk. And you can see that there's an extremely high risk associated with future scenario 2, 3, and 4 to the social endpoints, and then a slightly reduced risk of future 5. And that you can use to look at the relative vulnerability of the ecological endpoints versus the social endpoints. And if you compare the different scenarios, it allows you to look at trade-offs. The requirements, the environmental flow requirements associated with these endpoints were then provided to clients in the form of a flow duration table. And we just added a conditional formatting coloration here to show that the natural variability of flows for the different months of the year is still maintained. And another opportunity is to present the extent of the flooding in relation to the risk and the probable outcomes with these area inundation maps. Another example of how we present PROBFLO, that's the only example I have for this case study. I'd encourage you to look at the next blended learning module, where we give you more explicit indications of the application of PROBFLO in Africa. What we have done is we have initially carried out a case study. In fact, it's this case study on the coarse environmental flow assessment for the Nile Basin, where we've selected 9 sites in the Nile Basin along the length of the main stem and important tributaries to carry out the first holistic environmental flow assessment of the basin, and that information would be incorporated up into the environmental flow framework for the Nile Basin and contribute to the management of environmental flows on this large spatial scale. I do recommend that you look at the advantages and disadvantages, which I'm going to present briefly from the latest review of environmental flow assessment methods provided by Water for the Environment, and the editors Horn et al. Are the publications of this book, and it's been very useful. It is considered to be the latest review of these different methods and some advantages and disadvantages, and I'd recommend that you have a look at this textbook, and I'm going to present some of the outcomes of the advantages and disadvantages associated with the different environmental flow assessment methods that is presented in this textbook. So in this generalized comparison of the 4 main methods and frameworks used worldwide to estimate environmental water regimes for rivers from site to regional levels, we provide an opportunity to look at these environmental flow assessment methods. The first is the hydrological method. I'm going to present tables and allow for the comparison using the tables, and also just some summary comments. The first attribute we'll look at is the ecosystem attributes, components addressed, knowledge and expertise required for these assessments, resource intensity, resolution of the output in the context of environmental flows, and appropriate levels of application. So the hydrological methods are suitable for whole ecosystem conditional health assessments, but are non-specific, that are not specific. Some include the effects of components like physical habitat and fish requirements, for example. Knowledge and expertise required. These methods are primarily desktop with low data needs. They use virgin or naturalized or often reference state historical flow records. It can be daily, monthly, or even annual on occasion. It provides single flow indices, often of low metrics. That's what's required, or more commonly multiple ecological relevant flow metrics characterizing flow regime for the whole hydrograph. Some use historical ecological data, hydraulic data, habitat data, or meta-analyses of results for multiple environmental water assessments to derive rule tables for these requirements. So these are still hydrological methods, but they do use some generalized results of altered flows to propose the potential ecological, for example, consequences of some of these these changes in flows primarily. Few require ecological or geomorphological expertise, but such expertise, expertise is highly required for other methods. The resource intensity is the low time and associated costs, low to moderate technical capacity. The resolution of the output is mostly simple flow targets for maintenance of river health based on estimates of the percentage of annual, seasonal, or monthly volume, often termed the minimum flow. This should be left in the river to maintain acceptable habitats for varying levels of river condition, often expressed as a percentage of monthly flow or annual flow using the mean or median, or as limits to change in virtual flow parameters, commonly low flow indices. The result is low resolution, complexity, flexibility, and confidence, or moderate and dynamic in a few more recent regime-focused methods. The appropriate level of assessment is for reconnaissance and planning level of water resource developments that is unsuitable for high-profile negotiated cases or where whole flow regime dynamics are critical. As a tool within habitat simulation or heuristic methods, these hydrological methods are incorporated. For highly data deficient systems with limited ecological information, they can be considered as a first tier of assessment, and consider the regionalization potential for different river ecotypes. That's the consideration for hydrological methods. Some comments. They are used widely in many developed and developing countries or basins. Many of the simple single index outcomes, rule of thumb, and or lookup table approaches are incorporated in this category, including the Montana method, Tennant method, flow percentiles derived from flow duration curve analyses, for example, and there are other examples that were mentioned previously in the assessment. They become less common. There's a shift towards ecologically relevant flow metrics addressing multiple aspects of hydrological regimes, and there are some examples of that, for example, and the use of desktop models derived from metadata analyses of multiple environmental flow assessments, and the desktop reserve queues and Hamilton are examples of that. Next, we'll move on to habitat simulation methods. They are primary in-stream physical or habitat carried out for target species, guilds, or assemblages. Some also consider channel form, sediment transport, water quality, riparian vegetation, wildlife recreation, and aesthetics. The knowledge and expertise required includes moderate to high data needs for desktop and or can include field surveys to collect real data to establish those flow ecosystem relationships. Historical flow records typically average daily discharges required for these assessments. Few to many hydraulic variables are modeled at a rate of discharge, at a range of discharge, for more than one river cross section at different times of the year for different discharges to create these rating curves that are used in the hydraulic assessment. They require physical habitat availability, utilization, and preference data or similar models for target biota. A few use statistical summary methods based on the results of multiple physical habitat studies. High level of expertise is required with hydrologist, hydraulic habitat modeler. That may include hydrodynamic modeling, GIS remote sensing, ecological and or geomorphological expertise as well. The resource intensity is high to sometimes moderate, including time and cost and technical capacity. Output is weighted usable area or similar habitat metrics for target species of fish, invertebrates, plants, for example. They often include comparative analyses of time series of habitat data availability and the duration and use. Moderate to high resolution complexity, confidence is moderate flexibility. The appropriate levels of application of these habitat simulation methods includes water resource development, often large scale, involving rivers of moderate to high strategic importance, often with complex negotiated trade-offs among users. It is commonly used as a method within holistic methods and frameworks. Useful to examine a variety of alternative environmental water regime scenarios for several species of life stages or assemblages. Some comments include moves away from single species focus to increasing use for needs of species guilds and assemblages, and there are some examples of that being implemented, primarily applied in developed countries. using increasingly sophisticated and multi-dimensional or eco-hydraulic habitat modeling tools, and there's some examples. Less commonly used in developing countries or basin, and they're intending to be one of a suite of tools used in environmental water requirements as a holistic approach. Now we move on to the holistic assessments, and this is applicable to be applied at an entire ecosystem level or several ecological components. Mostly consider in-stream and riparian components. Some do consider groundwater, wetlands, floodplains, deltas, estuaries, and other ecosystems. Few consider geomorphological processes, including sediment dynamics, channel adjustment, for example, and or ecological functions, including nutrient dynamics, food web structures, for example. Several are explicitly address social and economic, example, livelihoods of rural subsistence users, human health attributes, dependencies on species, ecosystems, resources, and processes. Knowledge is moderate to high, but several are being used in data poor contexts where they establish these holistic assessments as frameworks, or these holistic environmental flow assessments are carried out, and then the uncertainty of those assessments are improved as more data becomes available. Desktop and often field studies are required, many reliant on the mix of data and expert judgment using expert panels. Some use both scientific and traditional knowledge to develop or infer flow, ecology, social relationships, for example. They use virgin or naturalized historical records or rainfall, other data for ungauged sites. Several use hydraulic habitat models and data and variable information from multiple cross-sections. Typically use biological data on a few ecological relationships for life cycle stages of aquatic and riparian species assemblages and components. Example, fish migration and spawning queues, riparian water quality tolerances, for example. So that's what we presented before. The resource intensity is moderate to high, with time, cost, and technical capacity required. Resolution of output is for the environment. Resolution of the output in environmental flow context. Recommended hydrological regime linked to explicit quantitative or qualitative ecological, geomorphological, and sometimes social and economic responses and consequences. Some address environmental water regimes for dry and wet years, moderate to high complexity and confidence, typically high resolution and flexibility. Several with potential to generate outputs for multiple scenarios, past and future development scenarios, for example. Some explicitly address probabilities, interactions, effects, risks, and or uncertainties. A few incorporate climate change. The appropriate level is water resource developments, typically at large scale, involving rivers of high conservation and or strategic importance, and or with complex negotiated trade-offs amongst the stakeholders. Simpler approaches, example, expert panels often used in basin context where flow ecology knowledge is limited and limited trade-offs exist amongst the users, and or time or resource and or capacity constraints exist. It is often used in planning stages of new developments to protect high conservation values, also used in highly modified or novel ecosystems with a focus on flow regime to deliver specific restoration objectives or to address socio-ecological values and services, especially in novel ecosystems. And then finally, expanding on the holistic methods to regional and landscape level holistic approaches. As for the other holistic methods, that's the river ecosystem type. Knowledge and expertise range from experts of different disciplines is required, including ecologists, hydrologists, geomorphologists. Several include social scientists and other specialists, water chemists and health scientists, for example, water managers, designed to use existing data sets and knowledge in some cases, including collection of new data or modeling system locations for interest for which hydrological and or ecological data is absent. The resource intensity is the same as holistic methods. Resolution of the output is in the context of environmental flows, quantified environmental water release rules or standards for rivers of contrasting hydrological type and ecotype, and points of management interest. At user-defined regional scales, flow alteration, ecological and or social response relationships per river type or by river type. As for other methods as well, consider that. The appropriate level, as for other holistic methods, is large system basin and or aggregations of smaller ones, regions, entire states, or multiple projects that may be integrated with water management systems, these regional scales. Comments on the regional level holistic assessments include they are increasingly commonly applied in developing and developed countries. The examples are BBM and other examples. Recent attention in developing regions focused on in-depth analyses of ecosystem components and less commonly functions and processes. It is used regularly in developing countries, including for capacity development and in complex basins with development pressures. In many cases, communities with clear dependencies on aquatic ecosystems, and there are many examples. At a regional scale, most applications are adaptations of a single framework, example ELOA, which we presented, as well as other examples are provided here, or similar approaches. Expansion underway from applications in a few developed countries to pilots in several developing countries, an increasing number of applications in large developing basins, with explicit links to water management tools and decision support systems, and that's where PROBFLO, the example, is provided. And finally, if I can refer you back to some literature, it's to consider background document 1, 2, and 3 from the Environmental Flow Framework Development Program in 2016, as well as the framework itself. Also like you to consider the global perspective on environmental flow assessments, emerging trends in the development and application of environmental flows in 2003 from Rebecca Thom. That was the first review. And then similarly, pleased to go look at this now 2017 review by Horn et al., titled Water for the Environment from Policy to Science and Implementation and Management. Also like you to consider Leroy Poff's ELOHA paper, and to visit the ELOHA website as well, and to see what's available on that website. Thank you very much. This was a bit of a mammoth blending module, and I'm sure that if we just slow down, we'll be able to get a lot from it. This is just in some cases, it's hard to imagine that this is just a snapshot of some of these methods and the advantages and disadvantages. There's lots of information available in the development of the framework for environmental flows for the Nile Basin. I'd also encourage you to look at more published information and to go through the strategy as well, and to in particular go through that textbook produced by Horn et al. If you would like any information, please contact Hydroc at info@hydroc.de to go to the Nile Basin website, and you can also have a look at the website of the University of Mpumalanga. Thank you very much. I hope that you benefit from this blended learning module.